Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution.
Welcome to the...
Oh, that was interesting. Here we go. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thanks, Buck Kincaid. Thank you, Agnes. And welcome to this version of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. It is a Wednesday afternoon. It is the 10th day of July. It is raining. We are having some storms in the area. We're hoping that it doesn't create technical problems for us. And I thank you for devoting your valuable time to today's version of the Virtual Center. And I encourage you to become a little bit more active in the program. And what I mean by that is I'm going to give you the phone number, and we would love to hear from you on some of these issues. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-3333. If you would like to contact me directly, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. And I mean it about the phone calls. We would love to hear from you. The more we can generate discussion about these issues. Heretofore, most of our programming has been oriented towards the delivery of information, and I think that's very important. But at the same time, to exchange ideas and perceptions of this information and its use. Today, we're going to be talking about an issue that I think is our next in line, and I mentioned this at the end of the program yesterday, and this is the idea of co-determination, the relationships between employers and labor in our economic system, and looking at it from the perspective presented to us by Scott, who in his wonderful email from Sweden has told us a little bit about co-determination as it currently works in Sweden. And that really is our program today, a good portion of it, because I think there's so much for reflection, so much information, and so much food for thought on this issue that I really do solicit your input, your reactions, your ideas. I think, again, that if we just take information and constantly let it pile up, we have ideas, we have thoughts that occur to us that other people would find very, very valuable, but they tend to fall by the wayside as new information generates new ideas. That's what's happened. That's what happens with thinking, intelligent, thinking, creative people. And by definition, the fact that you are listening to the Head On Radio Network generally and to this program specifically suggests that you are a thinking person. And what I mean by that is what really makes education happen is reaction and reflection and dialogue and conversation. And I know Bob Kincaid regularly talks about the Horn, the Head On Radio Network, as the conversation network. And that's really what it's about, the ability to chew on ideas and exchange perceptions and opinions on ideas and concepts. And that's really what it's all about. The generation of the information for yourself is meaningless if it doesn't do anything for the people who receive it. And that's really what we're talking about. I know, and I just want to make you aware, because I'm sure you are aware, that this is what Plato talked about frequently in his idea of education. Education is not the presentation of information. Education is the unearthing or the bringing to light of knowledge that's already there. It's already existent. It just It just needs to be brought out and clarified and exposed to the light of day and exposed to different perspectives. And that's what we're about here. That's what the Horn is about. And what we would like to do is encourage you to have this conversation with us and share your ideas and your perceptions with our listeners. Very honestly, I think, it's very important that we all recognize that as we think and as we reflect and as ideas occur to us, they are ideas that have value for other people. There's not somebody else calling with the same idea you're having. So if you don't express it, then it doesn't get expressed. And I think that's very significant. I've got a couple of things that I wanted to share. They're just pieces of information that I picked up today that I thought were very interesting. One of them was a piece that I was reading in the Nation, actually, in the magazine The Nation, online, which I think is very, very significant. It's about the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obama health care plan. And many of us know, I just wanted to point this out. This is more political than it is related to the Constitution, but I think it's so contemporary, it's so now, that I think, and affects so many of us, that I think it's important to recognize. The reporter who writes this story, whose name is Lee Fang, points out that much of this information came from documentation because the Nation requested it under the Freedom of Information Act. And what led to the request for this information, and what the information indeed documents, is that many of the voices that have been the loudest against Obamacare, especially from leading Republicans, who have in a variety of different ways committed themselves publicly to the fact that they will not support the idea. They vote consistently in Congress. I think Congress has had something like 39 votes to strike down, to vote against or to deny funding to the health care plan itself. And of course, it never goes anywhere because obviously it's not going to make it through a Senate where there is a Democratic majority. And so this is all for public, this is all PR stuff. This is all for public image as much as anything else. But one of the things that I think many of us would probably suspect, and I think this is what Lee Fang and the people at the Nation suspected, and they used the Freedom of Information Act to get the information to document this, is that many of these people who were the most outspoken against Obamacare, at the same time as politicians, are filing applications to get some of the money under this legislation for their own state. And the Nation reported, and we all knew during the last campaign, that Paul Ryan, who was Mitt Romney's running mate last fall in the 2012 election, requested Affordable Care Act money for health clinics in his districts 2 years before the election in 2010. And yet he was one of the, obviously, as vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party, one of the leading spokesmen who was committed to destroying the Affordable Care Act if he and Romney were elected president. And what this piece points out is that documents revealed under the Freedom of Information Act have indicated that a number of prominent Republican senators and congressmen who publicly speak out against Obamacare have written letters to Congress requesting funding. Two of those letters were written by Ohio Senator Rob Portman, who's being touted as a presidential potential GOP candidate in 2016. Two letters by Portman, one of which he requests funds to set up a federal health center in Cleveland, where he says that the money would help an additional 8,966 uninsured individuals to receive essential services. These are his words. This is a quotation. In another letter, a congresswoman, and I don't have the state, Christy Noem, who's a Republican a Republican congresswoman from South Dakota. Excuse me. She requested funds to construct a community health center in Rapid City, South Dakota, to provide primary services to the uninsured. Both of these people were elected in 2010, campaigning obviously as Tea Party supporters who vigorously opposed the law and have continually worked to repeal that law at the same time that they continue to request funding under it. Arizona's Governor, Jan Brewer, for example, who blasts the health care reform package, has received millions of dollars in Medicaid funding that the law provides. And the Freedom of Information Act has revealed that there are as many as 20 Republican congressmen and senators who fall under the same category. So they are publicly, for political image, they are publicly attacking it with the one hand. On the other hand, they're writing letters to Congress requesting funding for their own district to help their own constituents. So I guess what I'm saying here, the point is that we're learning an awful lot about the nature of politics. I don't think any of us are learning anything. I think many of us already knew this. But in most cases, at least for the folks, for you folks that are listening, my guess is this is merely confirming what you already knew. But I thought it was very, very interesting because it seems to be a little bit, I guess the word hypocritical is overused, but there it is. Yesterday in our program, we had concluded we were looking at our friend from Sweden's email, Scott's email. We've been looking at it for a few days, and I had pointed out at the end of the program yesterday that we would be dealing with the issue that he raised. We raised it right at the end of the program, and it's the idea of codetermination. So I want to begin with that, and I want to kind of expand on this a little bit, if we can, because I really believe, excuse me, I've got to get used to pushing this cough button. But we know that it's not a cough button; it's a reflection button. It's the moment of reflection where great thoughts happening. I used to remember all the time my graduate advisor, Merrill Jensen, when I was in graduate school, used to say all the time that many people believe that when Thomas Jefferson resigned from the Washington administration as Secretary of State, many people believe that he actually went back to Virginia, to Monticello, to think great thoughts, when in fact what he was doing was going back there and working up what became the agenda for what will ultimately become the Jeffersonian Republican Party in his election to the presidency in the year 2000. In the year 1800. I'm out of the 18th century. I got to get back there, and and the whole idea of thinking. So that's what I can think of every time I look at this button, this reflection button. I think, this is the time when we take a moment to have great thoughts, or to clear your throat, whichever happens to be most appropriate at the time. But I understand that Bob Kincaid is having the same situation that I've been having. I think I'm on the upside. I'm not sure that Bob is quite as yet. But the more people I talk to, the more I realize that there's, as they say, there's something going around. Anyway, let's go back to the issue that we closed yesterday's program with. The last thing that I remember was at the end of this paragraph, which is the story that Scott shares with us about Toys R Us when it came to Sweden a few years ago. So let's reread that paragraph, and then we can kind of pick up and go on from there. Scott is talking about the situation in Scandinavia with the idea of social democracy. And if you remember, he's talking about the ideas of American foreign policy in terms of cloning our current system. And his point is that if such a system were cloned upon Sweden, as Sweden currently operates, it would actually be a step backward, because social democracy has gone beyond where the United States currently is under its Constitution in terms of what he calls and what I call progress. And he says, should Scandinavia ever be bound via the EU, the European Union, to that sort of a free trade agreement, which is the kind of free trade agreement we want, it would be destructive to Scandinavian democracy and to the quality of life that currently exists there. And then he goes on, and this is the relevant paragraph. So if you'll bear with me. He said, I say this because the idea is inherent in Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday. We'll come back to it. I say this because the ideas inherent in Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are very much incorporated into social democratic political theory. For example, one of the features of the trade union movement lying at the heart of social democracy is what Swedes call medbestämmande, or codetermination is the term we would use in English, codetermination. By law, unions have representatives on boards of directors. Shop stewards have a say in company decision-making. Parents have a say in how schools are run, etc. At all levels, participation in the decision-making process is built in and is expected of you. The schools here make a point in teaching the next generation about the abuses of the old days, and how the real remedy, the only real remedy, is what Scott calls prophylactic participation in the democratic process. You act to protect class interest more so than your own individual interest. And in the printout of his email, I have that underlined. You act to protect your class interest more so than your individual interest. People here are much more aware than our Americans that one does not trust power. Old habits do not just die hard, they don't die at all. So political life consists of being a counterweight to the power structure in trying to always rein them in. Naturally, there are a lot of people who are naturally politically apathetic, but at least the message is out there and is acted upon in critical mass. Here's one example, and this is the Toys R Us story again. About 15 years ago, Scott tells us, Toys R Us entered Sweden, and its board decided to break the Swedish model. It was going non-union employment, no collective bargaining, very low wages, none of the usual overtime benefits, etc., a whole list of conditions. When the terms became known publicly, there were wildcat support strikes. Dock workers would not unload Toys R Us containers. Swedish truckers would not haul. But Toys R Us drove stuff in through Denmark. In other words, Toys R Us went around the back door and came into Sweden the other way. Next, bank workers quit processing Toys R Us transactions. All of these wildcat actions were non-sanctioned, but happened because people know that companies like Toys R Us represent, and I don't understand this part of the email. And then he said Toys R Us soon caved in. And that's where we stopped yesterday after reading that email. So that's kind of where I'd like to pick up our discussion in our program today. And there are several things about that paragraph that I want to address. One is the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft issue, which we did a little bit with yesterday, so we shouldn't take a whole lot of time on that. But the issue of codetermination needs some attention. And in giving that item, that issue of codetermination, the attention it warrants, I think it's going to require us to go into some labor management issues in the United States that many of us probably already know about. I know that there's a program in the evening on the Horn which addresses labor management relations pretty frequently. I think this is an issue that needs the light of day more and more all the time for reasons that I hope will become clear before we end our time together today. The other thing that I would like to address is the issue of the Toys R Us situation, not just in Sweden, but but the whole concept that it reveals. And what I'm talking there is the whole idea of solidarity. And I think we'll see in the email, as Scott's email continues, that he addresses that issue as well. So let's go back and kind of pick some of the key items out of this paragraph apart, because I think, again, I can't tell you how wonderful. I've tried to make it plain to Scott in an email response that I sent back to him as to how rich this is. I think he was a little bit hesitant because his sense was that much of what he was saying in this email are things that we've heard here on the program, or that some of the chats we did on the PRISM program that my friend and colleague Keith Lilly and I did, over the previous weeks, touched on many of these issues. And I think he thought that made his email redundant. On the contrary, what his email does is pull together so succinctly issues that need to be addressed, that need to be identified, that need to be targeted and highlighted and bolded, whatever the appropriate word is, because all of us need to understand these things. The Gemeinschaft-Gesellschaft issue is, deals with the issue, and we talked about this yesterday, so this is kind of review. Reflection moment there. This is kind of review, but it deals with the whole issue of class consciousness. And one of the things that Scott has mentioned is the emergence in Northern Europe, in European social democracies, of this idea of class consciousness and how vital it has become to the whole economic situation in these economies. And, of course, the contrast here is that in America, class consciousness has been directly associated with the idea of Marx. Karl Marx, communism, socialism, radicalism, danger, trouble, enemy, godlessness, all the terms that are associated with the idea of class consciousness. And the whole idea is that in America, we have tried as much as possible to convince the citizenry that America is not a class-based society, but is in fact a classless society. And of course, that's a term that Marx uses in the Communist Manifesto. At the end, his plan, his projected plan for communism is that ultimately communism will produce a classless society once all the elements of capitalism are weeded out of the system, are driven out of the system. Then ultimately we will have a classless society, and the power of the state that is initially so necessary in communism will be able to wither away. And many of us, of course, have grown up and have been taught since childhood that is the weakness in communist theory, and that power is never willingly surrendered, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's usually pointed out as to be the fallacy in Marx. I would suggest to you that is an invasion, not an invasion, an evasion of Marxism. That really, that sense of security and self-assurance about the impossibility of communism has satisfied an awful lot of people, and therefore has resulted in the fact that few people have taken on Marxism substantively, have felt the need to. And the fact of the matter is, nobody has effectively done that. Nobody has effectively taken it on. Nobody has effectively taken on Charles Beard and his economic interpretation of the Constitution, and his realization that the whole nature of property by the time of the late 18th century was changing. And the change in the concept of property is so vital to understand as we move into the post-Civil War United States and the Industrial Revolution, and all that it involves in terms of constitutional interpretation by the Supreme Court, and the emergence of the concept, the ideas of progressivism, and all that involves. So much of what we are today in American political society, it seems to me, is a product of changes that many, late 18th and 19th century changes, important changes, that few of us really understand. And I think that that's kind of our time together. And all this is remember, I'm just one person, and this is just my perception as to, after a career of more than a half century of teaching this kind of stuff. I like to believe that one of the things that drove me, that defined me as a teacher, is that throughout the process I never stopped learning. And what I mean by that is, and I've noticed this myself, that as I look back on syllabus, if I found myself teaching a course that I hadn't taught for a number of years, I look back on the syllabus that I put together in the first round, and I find out that I teach the course totally differently. And that's one of the things, at the end of my career, that's one of the things I really began to take pride in, is the fact that I never, I was really comfortable in the fact that I never taught the same class the same way twice. And I always attributed, that to the idea that I was continually learning and continually upgrading and improving. And so, but the point of that is, all I'm doing now is giving you my perceptions, and that's why at the beginning of the program, when I give the phone number, 304-658-3333, I want to throw that in. When I give the phone number and solicit your calls, I really mean that, because these are just my ideas. This is not fact. This is interpretation of fact. I'm trying to basically put together interpretations that seem to make sense to me. And the only way that I can refine them and improve them, is to get the benefit of your input, your thoughts, your ideas, your reactions. And without those, I leave not knowing any more than I did when I came in. And I just don't like to do that. That's not been my life, and I don't want it to be my life. So, anyway, with that, I think that's one of the things we need to know, that many of us in our day-to-day political existence, as we react to the news and to issues that political and social and economic issues that surround us. Many of us are doing it from a perspective, and because in ways we do because of a background that existed in this country that I think is very important that we understand, and that's hopefully what much of this is about. So the idea of class consciousness, it really never existed in the United States. In fact, there's no question that it was consciously an issue that was denied and constantly pushed off the table into the background. It is not something that we wanted our students to even know about. In fact, in the 50s and 60s, during the height of the McCarthy, in the 50s, during the height of the McCarthy era, this was, that was kind of one of the flagship terms. If you started talking about issues of class and working class and class consciousness and and people coming together and all this, this was considered to be a red flag. This was considered to be a symbol of danger, and obviously the nation responded to that appropriately. And by appropriately I mean given the priorities of that time, of that era of McCarthyism and fear of communist infiltration and all of that. So we are a society that has been raised in a culture which denies the idea of class and instead suggests that we are a classless society, or the alternative to that is that we are a society in which everybody is middle class. And one of the most interesting phenomenons that was seen, in sociological studies, and I've seen several surveys are done, and people will identify themselves as lower middle class or upper middle class or whatever. People never want to be identified as below middle class. And people are reluctant to identify themselves, to self-identify themselves as upper class. They wait for other people to do that for them. But they will fight tooth and nail to basically deny allegations that they are anything but middle class. They will reluctantly admit that they're lower middle class, but they will gladly admit that they are middle class. And so, all of this suggests something very, very interesting. And it suggests a sense of alienation against the idea of class consciousness, of class society. And the emphasis on the freedom of the individual, the emphasis on the rights, on American rights under the Declaration of Independence, the rights granted to citizens under the Bill of Rights, all of these things suggest the idea of the individual's free right, the right to speak, right to assemble, right to religious freedom, right to bear arms, right to do this, right to do that. And all of these are individual rights. And basically what we have put, the message we send out is we are a republic, a nation committed to the value and the sanctity of each individual human being. And therefore, it is not necessary for groups of people to unite with like groups of people and to act as a political force in order to get what they want. In this society, the opportunities are there for those who are willing to work for them, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Horatio Alger message. This is what the American dream is all about. And this is what brings people to our shores, is the idea of the individual freedoms and the opportunities available to individuals. I'm not putting that down at all. I'm not being negative toward it. What I am suggesting is that while all of that is part of what the American political social fabric is all about, that's the message that we choose to put out there as to what we are. That's the way we choose to define ourselves as a people. And, of course, that goes back to the founders. In the process, it tends to make more and more unpopular and less likely to be credible the idea of class consciousness. And so one of the major differences that Scott's email is bringing up is the existence of the idea of class consciousness as it exists in Western and Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Sweden specifically, and the opposition to that in the United States. And there is absolutely no question that public opinion and the way public opinion views union activity, labor unions, labor organizations, clearly stems from that cultural background, that cultural upbringing that all of us have. It is so pervasive that it's just there. It's not something that any of us see or recognize. It's just something that all of us believe. I can't tell you the number of people that have said to me when, in various situations about the idea of unions, and they will say there's just something un-American about the whole concept of a union. It's just not the American way. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. At this point, I'm not doing anything with it. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's that realization that I think all of us need to deal with, because until we can accept that, we really can't move on. So the whole idea of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, as laid out by Ferdinand Tönnies in the 19th century, which obviously Ferdinand Tönnies is a sociologist, a late 19th century sociologist. There's no question if you read his book, which is entitled Community and Society. In German, it's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Community and Society. He is laying out the ingredients of the two ideal types, the two ideal opposites. He is going to, he's going the extra mile, so to speak, to give us example after example after example. So there's absolutely no question that when you see the word Gemeinschaft, community, you know what it means. And he does the same thing with Gesellschaft. He provides so many situations, so many examples, that after reading it, it is impossible to not so understand the nature of Gesellschaft that when you are communicating with somebody else who has read the same book, you can communicate with each other so easily, because when you say Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft, everybody will know what it means. And one of the things that I did for several years in teaching history classes is I would take historical issues in American history or world history, it doesn't matter, take issues and ask people to apply this theory. I would go through a lecture in which I would acquaint students with Ferdinand Tönnies' Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft concepts. And what I tried to do was give them example after example so that they would be very, very clear that when they heard the term, they would know everybody would be thinking the same way. Everybody would be speaking a common language, if you will. And then basically what you could do, which was really kind of fun, actually. I hope it was good. It was a good learning tool. It surely was interesting in terms of the discussions that it sparked. But then you would throw out terms and issues and ask them questions like, would you, the most obvious question, the institution of slavery, applying the theories of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, how would you look at the institution of slavery? And immediately, the same students all the time. That's another issue. We'll deal with that another day. But hands would go up, and somebody would say, slavery clearly is Gesellschaft. No question. Why? Because it involves one person having total control and total power over another person. And many people would go to Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia and talk about the dangers of slavery as Jefferson laid them out. That no society can claim to be supportive of individual freedom and opportunity that engages, that accepts the legitimacy of slavery. But again, this I don't want to divert here, but I feel that it would be remiss if I didn't make this point. Jefferson, of course, makes, if you read on and read more clearly into his Notes on the State of Virginia, it's very clear that Jefferson's opposition to slavery has nothing to do with his concern for the slave. It has everything to do with his concern for the slave owner. Jefferson's hatred of slavery is based on the fact that he believes an individual having total power over another living being demeans and destroys the character of the slave owner. And his concern was that everything that the Declaration of Independence said, everything that America stood for, was in jeopardy as long as the nation continued to endorse and practice slavery, because the very people who had to implement the ideals of the founders had to do it within a context in which day-to-day life involved one person having total control over the actions and the freedoms of another person. And his concern was that the potential of America was in jeopardy as long as slavery existed here. That he believed that very, very firmly. And it's hard to argue with that. So his concern was not for the slave, it was for the slave owner. So slavery, he called it a fire bell in the night, and we've got to do something about slavery, but his principal concern was not the welfare of the slave. His principal concern was the welfare of the nation and the welfare of the society, because the existence of slavery within the society would ultimately corrupt the society from within. And I think that's a pretty powerful point. There's obviously more to it than that, like the rights of the human rights of the slave as a human being. That was not Jefferson's concern, and I think it's important to recognize that. But anyway, that's a diversion. Looking at the issue of the institution of slavery from the perspective of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, then I'm just using this as an example. Students would say that it's Gesellschaft, slavery is Gesellschaft because it's clearly a situation where one person owns another person, claims that person to be property, claims total control over him, has literally the right to take that person's life if the conditions are appropriate. In other words, under what the Constitution refers to as due process, and so therefore, that seems to be the extreme example of Gesellschaft. But if you really probe, and this is the hard part, if you really probe, every once in a while you'd get a student who would come up and say, "Well, I'm not comfortable with that," and then you'd ask why, and they would say, "Well, if you really believe that a slave is inferior to a white person, if you really believe that one race is inferior to another, if you really believe that as a Christian, one is responsible for his fellow man, if you believe that as a slave owner, you're not setting out to abuse the slave, you're setting out to provide for the needs of people who are incapable of taking care of themselves. If you, as a slave owner, manage your slave or slaves from a perspective of concern and generosity and humanity, then what you are doing is providing security, providing a roof over their heads, providing medical care, providing food, providing shelter, providing security for some sort of a family life. In other words, what you are doing is taking care of those who are incapable of taking care of themselves. If that's the way you look at slavery, then slavery is more Gemeinschaft than it is Gesellschaft. And that's when the discussion would start. If somebody would raise that issue, that's when the discussion would start. So the point is, and of course what that Gemeinschaft position was really doing was laying out the major tenets of the pro-slavery argument that the slaveocracy made as a defense against slavery. And as we pointed out yesterday, one of the major defenses was that generally one could say that the slave owner treated his slaves much more humanely than industrial capitalists treated their employees who were working in their factories. Because under capitalism, industrial capitalism, employees were made to be exploited. I mean, that was the name of the game. So given the inhumanity that seemed to exist in the industrial system, given the lack of concern between the employer and the employee in industrialism, then the slave owners and defenders of slavery in the South readily claimed that from that perspective, slavery was a lot more humane, a lot more Gemeinschaft-like than was industrial capitalism. And so then you could talk about the nature of capitalism, whether in fact capitalism is Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft. One more, and then we'll drop, because this is not the theme. Obviously, our message here is a little bit, this is a diversion, but I think it's an important one. One more example of the Gemeinschaft-Gesellschaft controversy, and it's one, of course, that I would naturally go to. I would throw out the issue of education. And immediately, no less often than the slavery issue, hands would go up, and people would say, education is Gesellschaft. And then you'd ask why. And they'd say, because the whole idea of education is to get a job. You need a degree to get a job. If you read the help wanted ads, you can't even apply unless you have a certain degree in a certain area. There are certain requirements. There are educational requirements. You have to have a diploma. You have to have post-secondary education of some kind. You have to have an associate degree, or you have to have a bachelor's degree, or you have to have a master's degree, or you have to have a PhD, or you have to have a medical degree, or you have to have a law degree, or you have to have a license as a sociologist, or a license as a social worker, or you have to be a practicing psychologist, and you have to be licensed as a counselor, and on and on and on. In other words, there's no question that everything that we see around us that comes under the heading of education has a Gesellschaft facet to it. And if you poll students, why are you here to get a job? Why are you going to college? Why are you willing to go into debt for a degree? Because this is the only way that I can get a job and take care of my family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these are rational, conscious, calculated decisions that the individual makes, which is the typical definition of Gesellschaft. And just as on the slavery issue, every once in a while, a student would reluctantly raise a hand, his or her hand, and it would often be reluctantly because people were uncomfortable with it. And then they would say, well, what about the person that's going to school because they really want to learn? What about the person that's going to school because they want to better, because they really want to grow, or because they value knowledge and they respect wisdom and they seek to know and understand what life is about and answer some of the big questions? And then you start getting into the Emersons and the Transcendentalists and the Platos and the Socrateses and the, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you begin to look at the whole idea, at Plato's whole idea, that that the whole purpose, the whole point of education is knowledge. And the whole idea of knowledge is to pursue human happiness. And the definition of happiness is being aware of what life and its realities are all about. In other words, knowing about what Plato referred to as the good. So the pursuit of the good causes one to look at education in a totally different way. And that's the approach to education that produces our musicians and our composers and our artists and our sculptors and our architects. If you use your innate God-given talents to fulfill the talents and the wisdom, the ability that you have, if you create music or compose music or play music because you have this particular talent and your ultimate goal is to make people happy by giving them the opportunity to share in the beauty of what you are able to create, then that is classic Gemeinschaft. On the other hand, if you're pursuing a degree in music or art or poetry or, literature or something like that in order to get a job, then it's a means to an end rather than an end in itself. It's Gesellschaft rather than Gemeinschaft. And so you go back and forth depending on how you look at these things. But the more comfortable with the term you become, you begin to realize that people, as was Tunney's, are very uncomfortable with the extremes of Gesellschaft. And on the other hand, people are very comfortable and have a very, very soft spot in their heart, if you will, for Gemeinschaft. People want to believe that Gemeinschaft is what their life can and will be all about. But the fact of the matter is, as Tunney's points out, the history of man seems to be the transition away from Gemeinschaft and more towards Gesellschaft. And then we get, and I use this example for obvious reasons, then you get to somebody like James Madison in Federalist Number 10, who basically points out that factions are sown in the nature of man, which is his way of saying that Gemeinschaft is a dream. The ideals of civic virtue and people being willing to put aside their own self-interest on behalf of the public interest, to put other people's welfare ahead of their own, is a dream. It's a dream that we had in 1776, that the founders had at the time of independence. It was the dream that caused a lot of people to fight and even die for the independence of this nation. But the fact of the matter is, it was ripe with naivete. We were too idealistic. We were not realistic enough. And what we've seen happen once independence was won has proven to us that we were too optimistic, we were too idealistic, and that ultimately we have to deal with the reality of what is. And what is Gesellschaft. What is man will use his reason and use his freedom to organize and manipulate and do whatever he needs to do to benefit himself first. The public interest will always come second. And so what we need to do, Madison says in Federalist Number 10, in order to create a political republic, in order to really create a republic in which power emanates from the people, and that decisions are based on the consent of the governed and all the terms that we throw around. In order to make this happen, what we have to do is set up a system that is internally secure enough to not be vulnerable to factional takeover. What we need to do is come up with a system which pits faction against faction. In other words, a system which could be destroyed if the majority faction comes to power is a system that can only avoid that from happening by pitting group against group, faction against faction. And it is the internal checks and balances within the political system which guarantees its stability and its permanence. What Madison doesn't say, but people understand that this is exactly what he means, is that such a system, besides producing security and stability and preserving the freedom of the individual and the private success, which means the property of the individual, what this also means is that power continues to reside in the hands of the minority rather than the majority. That's the reality of what this is all about. And then we go back to the Confederation period and what's wrong with the Confederation and his vices of the U.S. political system and all the rest of it. But so this issue of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft is very, very helpful in terms of examining what's going on and what the priorities are and what the perspective it happens to be. So in a sense, there's an inclination, and I think the examples of education and slavery serve to point out that this Gemeinschaft idea is susceptible, obviously, to interpretation. It depends on the spin that you put on it, how you look at these issues as to whether they are one or the other. So in a sense, the only way that people can accept the realities of Gesellschaft is to believe that they constitute Gemeinschaft. Madison's belief is that the political system created in Philadelphia in 1787 is the most appropriate, the best system for man, because it's the system designed to deal with man as he really is. In other words, it is based on a definition of human nature. We know that psychologists and medical people and researchers continue to try to get a handle more and more on what is human nature, what human nature is. Is it nature or nurture? Is it a combination of both? Is one more powerful than the other? Is environment more powerful than genetics, than genetic makeup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We have these debates all the time. But the fact of the matter is the Constitution of the United States is based on the premise that we know exactly what human nature is, and that we have designed a political system to deal with it. But the reality is that individuals growing up in that environment, if environment has any effect on human nature at all, then growing up in an environment which is based on the premise that Gesellschaft is Gemeinschaft will act in ways appropriate to the environment that they live in. In other words, rather than the system being designed to handle the behavior of the people in it, are we really looking at a situation where the people in it become the products of the environment in which they are raised? Heavy? Time for reflection. That may be the critical issue. The fact of the matter is that as head-on listeners, as people who are drawn to the kinds of conversation and the kinds of issues raised here, and on the Horn, it's obvious that when you begin to ask questions, and when you begin to look for agendas, for personal agendas, when you begin to read between the lines of primary documents, for example, when you begin to look at letters from the perspective of what is the intent, what is the planned outcome, what's the purpose of this, what does the person who wrote this want to happen, what's this about? When you ask those kinds of questions, you are moving in to an area which is anathema to those who wish to maintain the illusion that Gesellschaft is Gemeinschaft. In other words, Gemeinschaft is reliant almost exclusively on believing the spin, on falling for the message, on listening to the message and believing what you hear. If the only message about what the news is about that makes you comfortable is to turn on Fox News, then ultimately you are seeking Gemeinschaft. You are seeking a point. Well, you may be sinking. That's, a slip of the tongue there, but, an appropriate one. You are seeking an interpretation of the news which fits your comfort zone, which fits naturally into what you want to believe. So you have created your own little world of Gemeinschaft. And you have chosen to go to the places where that little world of yours is not going to be shattered, is not going to be questioned, is not going to be challenged. You have a comfort zone, and your goal is to maintain that comfort zone. My goal as an educator is to shake you and shake up that comfort zone, is to force you to confront the assumptions on which your comfort zone is based. That's the value of primary source material. That's the value of reading between the lines. That's the value of the kind of education that Plato is talking about. That's the value of analysis. Real education is being able to see Gemeinschaft, but also to be able to recognize Gesellschaft as well. True education is the ability to be able to separate Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft and to recognize the difference. Popular education, for most people, is an effort to maintain Gemeinschaft. And the way to do that is to create the comfort zone. And the way to create the comfort zone is not to acknowledge the realities of Gesellschaft. And the way to not acknowledge the realities of Gesellschaft is to not permit the questions to be raised. The kinds of questions that will lead to recognition of Gesellschaft within the mindset of a world that appears to be Gemeinschaft is the kind of education that scares us. And I believe that's really what the issues are about. So in a sense, what we're talking about here is going back to Scott's email for a second, and we're setting up our break here. It's 2 minutes after the top of the hour. In order to understand the concept of codetermination, we've got to be able to understand the realities and the implications of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft and how they interact with each other. And again, we could use other terms. We don't need to use Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. But since we've devoted so much time to those terms, I'm kind of comfortable with the fact that when I use them, you know what I mean. And I think that's a good way to address the issue of codetermination as an example of the nature of our society. And we'll do that when we come back. Let's take a break. It's 2 minutes after the top of the hour. Let's take 4 or 5 minutes and do some serious reflection. Thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. If you are just joining us, we welcome you. If you've been with us, we appreciate your staying with us, and I genuinely mean that. I also want to remind you that as a regular listener of the Horn, which I hope you are, that it is very, very important to keep programs, not just this program, but programs that you hear on the Horn on the air. I think one of the things that becomes very clear, the further we go with the Virtual Center, is the more vital and the more important the voice. We were talking about in weeks ago about the Constitution of the United States and about the ideal of the marketplace of ideas. And there's absolutely no question that the marketplace, the arguments of the Supreme Court in the 2010 decision, Citizens United, about the right of corporate money, the right of corporations to be heard in the marketplace, in the exchange of ideas in the marketplace. It's very important to keep the voices that you hear, the points of view that you hear regularly on the Horn in that marketplace as well. So again, if you can find a way to, it's very, very easy. It's very, very important. And I think, I hope you appreciate the fact that this is not just an idle moment. This is not just an idle request. This is serious stuff, and it's very important to keep these kinds of programs on the air, and hopefully to secure and grow more of them. I think the louder this voice becomes, the better the results will be when the decisions are made. If you know what I mean. I wanted to go back to where we were before the break, and let me begin again by giving you the phone number, area code 304-658-3333, 304-658-3333. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. I had a very, very positive experience this morning at 9 o'clock. I was meeting a friend for breakfast here in southern West Virginia, and I had no idea until I showed up for breakfast that a mutual friend, was joining us with her husband. This friend was someone that I've known for more than 20 years. She and her husband are relocating from southern West Virginia into northern Georgia, and they're leaving in the morning, tomorrow morning. So this breakfast was indeed the last opportunity that I was going to have to see her before she left. And we had a wonderful hour, close to an hour and a half. We didn't eat all that time, obviously. We talked mostly. And Elaine, her name is Elaine, and Elaine reminded me that the first time we had met was in a history class that I had taught in the early 90s, which was, 20 years ago. And she also reminded me that in this class, one of the books that was assigned that required reading was Howard Zinn's History of the United States. People's History of the United States. What used to be referred to as history from the bottom up. If you know what I mean by that term, you'll understand Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a professor of history at Boston University. He passed away, I believe, about 3 years ago. And it wasn't just me that used to require Howard Zinn's book. When I came to Concord University in 1991, every United States history course that was offered used the same books, and one of the required readings was Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So I was just basically, falling into the fold, so to speak. But anyway, Elaine's comment was, she said, I remember when I took your history class, when we first met, one of the books that we had to read was Howard Zinn. And I remember you talking about in colonial America, and the reason I'm saying this because I had totally forgotten about it, but it's so appropriate to what we're talking about right now. And she said, one of the things I remember you pointing out was that in the Chesapeake area, in Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland, in the tobacco-producing areas especially, as slavery at first was competing with and then gradually began to replace the indentured servant system. Colonies, these were colonies, this before the Revolution, obviously. This was in the early 18th century, before 1776. Under the indentured servant system, states passed rules whereby the conditions defining indentured servitude from slavery began to distinguish and differentiate themselves. At first, indentured servitude and slavery were the same. Only gradually did slavery begin to distinguish itself based principally on race. But once the racial distinction was made between indentured servitude and slavery, then the circumstances that defined indentured servitude versus slavery began to change as well. And she pointed out that one of the differences that I used to emphasize was that when the period of indenture was up, an indentured servant signed a contract where in return for passage, relocation to the New World and an opportunity, after the period of indenture was up, the indentured servant was entitled to become a landowner, was entitled to receive a plot of land and animals and seed and all the rest of it, everything that allowed the indentured servant system to become a free American. And those conditions began to define indentured servitude, but they did not define slavery. In other words, slavery, once it became distinguished principally by race, slavery became permanent, whereas indentured servitude was limited. But that wasn't the only difference, of course. The real difference was that indentured servitude was opportunity. Indentured servitude was the equivalent of being in training before you became a skilled worker. In industrial terms, indentured servitude was the period of indenture was the period when was like in the industrial world when you work for the skilled craftsman and you learn the craft. You learn from the master. And then only when the master defined you as having learned the skills that qualified you to be accepted into the guild or into the trade, as it were, only then were you considered to be a skilled worker. So, in a sense, indentured servitude was perfectly in tune with what the American dream was all about. It was an investment of time. It was an investment of labor for a period of time which led to something better. It was a choice that you made. It was a contract that you signed. It was an opportunity to do this in exchange for something much better in the future. And that opportunity was not visible in the laws governing and defining slavery. So that the differences began with race, but they obviously became much more differentiated as time went on. Anyway, the point of the story was Elaine made that point. But the other point she made, and this is the point that I'm leading to, she said one of the points I made at that time, and of course I was dealing with Howard Zinn, principally Howard Zinn's book on the colonial period, because he made this point, was that every conscious effort was made to distinguish as the colonial period moved on. Every effort was made to make a distinction between the indentured servant and the slave. There was a conscious effort to make sure that indentured servants knew that they were not the same as slaves, that they were different, they were better, they had a future. And so consequently, there was a conscious effort here to make sure that there was never a sense of unity or solidarity amongst these agricultural and later on skilled workers. They became carpenters, and they became, barrel makers and various other trades that they learned. But one was a slave and one was not, and the distinction was never, ever far from being visible. And the obvious point was the fear that if these groups ever united, and throughout the period prior to the Civil War, if you studied Southern society, there was a conscious effort to make sure that slaves and poor whites never saw themselves as brothers, as united. There was basically what we're talking about here is the application of Madison's formula in Federalist 51 of pitting faction against faction, ambition versus ambition, group against group, in order to make sure that there's not a majority faction. What that means in real terms is making sure that there is not class consciousness, that there is not a sense of class. And there's a conscious effort to make sure that that kinds of class consciousness never happens. One of the most controversial and discussed in today's literature, the hottest item in early American history that is being discussed today at conferences and conventions by professional historians, relates to the issue of slavery. There is a very, very strong effort to argue among some historians that the real story behind American independence was an effort to blunt the British promise of freedom to slaves in America if they came over to the British side. Dunmore in Virginia, in the Virginia of in the mid 18th century Virginia. Dunmore's promise at the start of the Revolution that if slaves would come over and support the British effort, their reward would be freedom. And slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas were appalled that effectively the king was inciting race war, civil war, discord within society by threatening slave revolts. And there are there are prominent historians who are arguing that the real story behind the decision on the part of many people to go for independence was that was the only way to preserve the stability of the society that existed. Because what England was promising slaves suggested the potential of civil war, race war within society. And there is every indication in the world that one of Jefferson's points in the Declaration, his charges against the king, is that that is in fact what the king was doing, was inciting internal rebellion. That's what that refers to. Many historians are arguing that that kind of ought to be at the top of the heap in the minds of many people. But again, I'm not arguing or emphasizing that. My point is the historical precedent for this idea of divide and conquer, the idea of discouraging solidarity within groups, the need to continually promote division, to promote factionalism in order to guarantee the stability of society. And it is absolutely essential in order to understand labor history in the United States. The idea that in Scott's email in Sweden, Swedish people would be comfortable with the idea of the fact that certain people belong to the working class, and as such, they are willing to put their class interests ahead of self-interest. Or to put it another way, they are unwilling to allow self-interest, their own self-interest, to take precedence over what's best for the society as a whole or for the best interests of their class, is what allowed these people to come together without any organized plan to react negatively to what Toys R Us was trying to do in Sweden 15 years ago, which was to destroy this system and replace it with the system that we have in the United States today, which is kind of every man for himself. And the umbrella that covers that is this idea we hear all the time about right to work. What we are talking about is ways to discourage a sense of unity and togetherness and brotherhood and solidarity. I don't care what term you use within the working class. Co-determination, the very concept of co-determination, and let me again share with you Scott's definition or explanation of the term. By law, unions have representatives on boards of directors. Shop stewards have a say in company decision-making. Parents have a say in how the schools are run. At all levels, participation in the decision-making process is built in and is expected of all citizens. The schools here make a point of teaching the next generation about the abuses in the old days and how the only real remedy is prophylactic participation in the democratic process. You act to protect your class interest more than your individual interest. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up the term co-determination, here's what you're going to find. Co-determination is a practice whereby the employees have a role in management of a company. The word is a literal translation from the German word Mitbestimmung. And Mitbestimmung is German, and Scott tells us that Medbestämmande is Swedish for the same term. In some countries, this is what Wikipedia says, in some countries, like the United States, the workers have virtually no role in management of companies, and in some, like Germany, their role is more important. Obviously, in Sweden, their role is more important. The first serious co-determination laws began in Germany. Of course, we go back to the Scott's comment yesterday about Bismarck and the beginning of the welfare state. At first, there was only worker participation in management in the coal and steel industries. But in 1976, a general law was passed mandating that worker representatives hold seats on the boards of all companies employing more than 500 people. This is co-determination. And then Wikipedia makes the following points. And you can go, there's numerous articles on the on the internet that you can look at. I won't go into all of those right now. But the website says there are three main views as to why co-determination exists. First, to reduce management labor conflict by means of improving and systematizing communication channels between the two. Second, to increase bargaining power of workers at the expense of owners by means of legislation. Third, to correct market failures by means of public policy. Basically, what we're talking about here, and this is the point that I really want to make, is that co-determination requires a basic sense of recognition. It is based on, it seems to me, one basic principle, and that is that if we expect to produce the best, we've got to work together rather than at odds with each other. Let me present it in another way. This is not taken from notes. This is totally out of my head, but it's something that I believe very, very firmly. One of the things we've noticed going on in American society today, in the so-called recovery from the recession, as we look at the monthly job numbers, is that the unemployment rate stays woefully high. The last one, at the beginning of July, the numbers for June were the same as the numbers for May. Unemployment in the nation averaged 7.6%. It's lower in some areas, it's higher in others, but the average is 7.6%. It's been in the 7.6, 7.7, 7.8 range for a long time. And I think it's been close to the 7.6, 7.7, 7.8 range for a long time. And I think one of the reasons for that, I've been, I think I'm getting a little bit agitated here, and I'm moving away from the mic, and I can't do that. Apparently, the mic I have is not the best. It doesn't follow me. It's not on wheels. And the result is that in spite of the fact that the numbers indicate in the housing market and various other places that the recession has bottomed out and that the recovery is underway, experts tell us that the recovery is not happening as fast as we would hope. And where it's really not happening is in the creation of jobs. Companies are not hiring. And yet at the same time, we are aware that companies are sitting on more capital, more cash, than they've ever had access to in history. My wife came home today from the local bank. She wanted to know basically what the bank was paying on CDs, and she came home with a list. They gave her a printout of what they're paying. And the point was that no matter how long you are willing to give your money to the bank for, your return on the CD is woefully low. It doesn't get above 2% until you get into the $10,000 range or something like that. But if you're gonna take out a CD or you're gonna put money in a savings account, the interest return that you're going to get is in the 0.001 range. The conclusion is the banks don't want your money. And the reason that they don't want your money is because the economy is awash in money. Corporations are sitting on more money than's ever been available before. But they aren't creating jobs with it. And we can get into all the political arguments as to why that might be true. But the fact of the matter is, one of the missing elements in this whole situation is the general recognition that in a world which has become flat, Tom Friedman's book from several years ago, in a world in which for the first time America must really compete for advantage, in a world which is becoming more technologically savvy and therefore is making available to everybody, everywhere, the advantages that used to be available only to American manufacturers and American industry and American producers. It's becoming very clear that the only way that we are not going to continue to see the outflow of jobs to the places where the labor is cheapest, the only way that we are going to see a return of jobs to America is when we can honestly say that what we make and what we produce and the services we provide here and the medical care we provide here is the best available on the face of the planet. for the first time, we are in a position where no longer can we claim that what we offer is better than anybody else's. We are in a position where we have to put up or shut up. In order to do that, we really need to believe that we're all in this together. We really need to believe that our advantage, the success of the company, whatever the company's field is, whether it's in the provision of services or technological information or technological support or medical care or whatever it is, in order to make sure that it's the best, then that means that everybody involved in putting the product together or the service together has to be involved in the process. And the reality is that the people who do it are the only people who can guarantee that what they do is better than anybody else's. If we are going to be the best, we are going to have to rely on the people who do it to make it the best. And that means we have got to bring those people to the table. It sounds like I'm setting up here for an attack on corporate America. But I would suggest to you that this is bigger than that. It requires a whole hell of a lot from labor as well. Because it really requires that labor begin to change its focus, to change its message, and to really commit to the idea that we either all win or we all lose. I'm thinking of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, when he was speaking at the Atlanta Exposition to the businessmen, the so-called middle-class community, industrial community, or what there was of it in the South. And he was basically lobbying for the inclusion of ex-slaves in the South's economic future. And his point was, there are 8 million of us here. That means 16 million hands who can either help to pull the load if you include us, or if you choose to exclude us, we will hold you back like an anchor and the South's economic development will go nowhere. It is a compromise which the white South verbally chose to accept, but only to which they only were willing to pay lip service. The South chose division and exclusion and segregation, Jim Crow, rather than inclusion and economic development. And that is just one example of what we're talking about here. We see it in labor all the time. We're seeing it here right now. And the big issue here in obviously West Virginia, for obvious reasons, is the recently decided in St. Louis Patriot Coal case, in which the company claimed bankruptcy and therefore voided its liability to the retirement and pension benefits guaranteed to retired coal miners and their families. And the UMW was up in arms. Major protests were held in St. Louis, if you remember, a month ago or so. And recently, here in West Virginia, there's major demonstrations in Charleston against Patriot Coal for this decision. But the fact of the matter is that for a long time, this is very controversial in this area, so I hope you were aware of that. For a long time, here in West Virginia, coal miners have watched their jobs disappear because of technology and mountaintop removal as opposed to underground mining. If underground mining continued, that would require more coal jobs. But with the expansion and growth of mountaintop removal, that meant that companies could produce more coal with less employees. So the result is that for a long time, the number of coal jobs in West Virginia has been on a precipitous decline. In the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, there were in excess of 116,000 coal jobs in West Virginia. That number now is less than 25,000. And over the last few years, there has been a conscious effort to pin this on the Obama administration and on the EPA. And the UMW has supported that. And the UMW has joined the workers and the employers have joined together to take issue with EPA environmental requirements under the argument that it's costing coal jobs. When the fact of the matter is the companies themselves have been most responsible for the elimination of coal jobs, and anybody with who was halfway objective would realize that. And the fact of the matter is, while this campaign has been going on, right to work and all that's associated with it has been going on around West Virginia and within West Virginia. And company after company has been finding ways to undercut salaries, to not pay prevailing wage on construction jobs, to deny teachers a meaningful role in the decisions that govern how they teach and what they teach and when they teach it. And organized labor has been unwilling to stand up. And it's the old story of if they come for one group, and then they come for another group, and then they come for another group, and if nobody says anything, there's going to come a time when the knock is going to come at the door, and it's going to be for you. And the fact of the matter is that's been happening, not just here, not just in West Virginia, not just in coal mining. It's happening everywhere in this country. And what it's replacing is the mindset that would make something like co-determination a possible reality in America. Why is it possible for Wikipedia to say as a statement of fact, in some countries like the United States of America, the workers have virtually no role in management of companies, while in some, like Germany, their role is more important? Why is that? Is that just an accident? Is there something in the air, or in the water, or in the food, or in the caloric intake, or in the makeup of the United States of America that makes workers here less capable of participating in the major decisions about how a product is made or not made, how a service is delivered or not delivered. We are in an age of technological revolution in this country. We have reached a point in this country where technology is changing so rapidly that even the people who are in the business can't keep up with the changes. And the fact of the matter is, the people who are making the changes are the people who are doing it, not the people who are managing the company, not the people who are making the investment decisions and the financial decisions on Wall Street. The people who are making the innovations, the people who are involved in the creativity, are the people who are actually doing it, the people who are providing the service, making the product, conducting the research, manufacturing the automobile, whatever, building the bridge, whatever it happens to be. To not include them in the decisions which are going to determine the success of the United States economy in competition with the world is insanity. It's blindness. It's naivete. It's absurd. The problem is labor is going to have to make that case. Labor's mantra is going to have to become the fact that the difference between what we provide and what you can get everywhere else is quality. If you want your bridge to last, if you want your building to stand, if you want your student to be able to read, then you have got to be willing to allow the people who are engaged in the doing to be involved in the process of decision-making that govern the doing. You can't continue to allow the separation to happen. And you certainly can't continue to play the gazelle shaft-like game of pitting group against group, skilled worker against unskilled worker, black worker against white worker, female worker against male worker, in order to keep them from uniting, from keeping them to recognize that they have a common interest. Because, damn it, their common interest is your common interest. It's our common interests. It's America's common interest. And the only way it can prevail is when it becomes the common interest. What we're talking about here is something that has to overcome a tremendous historical background. All of the precedents are pointing in the opposite direction. History tells us that exactly the opposite is what needs to happen. The only way we can begin to change that is to begin to educate people, is to begin to see rather than continue to believe, is to begin to recognize gazelle shaft when there are forces whose interest is designed to make us only see Gemeinschaft. To recognize that what we need is real Gemeinschaft, not illusion of Gemeinschaft, not the kind of illusory Gemeinschaft, which suggests that what we do because that's the way people really are. People are and people behave in ways that are going to produce success for them. And the reality is their avenue to success is our avenue to success. And when we begin to realize that we're all in this together, codetermination doesn't become just some word that only associated with other peoples in other countries, with other cultures and other political system that don't know what they're doing because they don't know the value of freedom. Freedom is the ability to produce, is the ability to pursue your own dreams. And the pursuit of your own dreams requires that you are freed from the need to pursue the day-to-day needs for survival. When you have to work 3 jobs in order to provide for a family, and you have to make a choice between food or medical care, and you can't afford to get a medical procedure done on a member of your family when somebody else is doing it. We had a situation here in West Virginia. I've got to share this story with you because it's important. At a convention that I attended in April, we had 2 wonderful presentations, both of them based here in West Virginia. One was about something unbelievable that's going to happen here in southern West Virginia within the next week. And it's going to be the arrival of the Boy Scout Jamboree. The whole operation has moved into southern West Virginia, and 10,000 acres has been developed for the Boy Scout Jamboree. And there's going to be something in the neighborhood of 40,000 scouts here in southern West Virginia later on this month. And that's going to mean not only scouts, but their families and the filling up of hotels, and the restaurants are going to be full and all the rest of it. Tourist-wise and business-wise, it's going to be a boom for the area, there's no question. And one of the presentations at this conference I presented was presented by the people who were instrumental in building what is called the Bechtel Summit. And the point that they made is that more than $230 million has been invested in the development of this site. And it's going to bring all of this traffic and all these people into West Virginia. $230 million, and there were slides presented and everything else. It was a fantastic presentation, and it's so exciting for this region, and everybody here is trying to prepare for what is going to be something totally different in their lives. It's an exciting period to be here. And at this conference, after this presentation, everybody was wowed by it, and especially by the number of upwards of $230 million. We had a coffee break. And the program after the coffee break was presented by a gentleman who runs a homeless shelter in Huntington, West Virginia. And his mission, he had been diagnosed a number of years ago with terminal cancer and was not projected to survive. And of course, he has survived. And he's dedicating his whole life to service. And he had made the decision that what he was going to do was walk through all 55 counties in the state of West Virginia. His goal was to raise $10,000 for the homeless in every county that he walked through, all 55 of them. And his presentation to our group was an effort to win the support of our group so that we would welcome him when he came to our county, and we would make sure that he was fed lunch and had a place to sleep and those kinds of things. And I sat there, and all I could think about was the inconsistency of a pre-coffee break program talking about the investment of $230 million in southern West Virginia for a Boy Scout Jamboree, followed by a gentleman who was going to walk literally across the state from county to county trying to raise money to take care of the homeless. And nobody saw the inconsistency in that. And that inconsistency is what I'm talking about. We have got to begin to see what is and what isn't. We have got to begin to see that what is Gemeinschaft is really Gemeinschaft. And when it's Gesellschaft, portraying Gemeinschaft, we've got to be able to see that as well. We have got to begin to move in a different direction. I think this is not a negative situation. On the contrary, I think it is one of the most exciting periods. It is one of the most exciting opportunities that this nation has to fulfill its potential for exceptionalism. The opportunities for working people in a rapidly changing environment to participate in the decisions that affect their lives and to benefit from the profits that come from those decisions is a challenge, but it's one of the most exciting opportunities that I think this nation has ever experienced. It's an opportunity I hope we choose to accept. I trust, I hope, I pray that labor, organized labor, chooses to take this road. This is the way. It is working in other societies on a minor scale. The whole idea behind America and the Industrial Revolution in America and the Information Revolution which is underway in America, what drives America is the idea. What has driven American foreign policy and continues to do so is the idea that in a world of free international open trade, in a NAFTA-like world, we, the United States of America, can prevail. We can dominate. Think of what we could do if we really apply all of our resources to that mission. If we really walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. From where I sit, codetermination as a concept may be the most challenging and exciting opportunity that this nation has experienced or come across in a long, long time. It's a challenge. It's a challenge that labor needs to take on. It's a challenge that corporate America needs to recognize and appreciate. Because once both sides begin to see that there's more to be gained than there is to lose, we all begin to win. I've gone to the top. Bob, I apologize. It's 59 minutes after the hour, and I haven't given Bob Kincaid time to take his, I was going to say take his jacket off, but it's summertime, so you don't have to do that. This is Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. I thank you for our time together. Please be safe. We'll get back together again the first of next week. Thank you for tuning in.